All right, good morning, seniors. Today I'm just going to talk about three more issues that modern journalists face, and those issues are fake news, sensationalism, and clickbait. And again, I'm going to go through these pretty briefly, giving you a broad overview. And if these are your three topics, then you are again expected to do deeper, more in-depth clarifying research on your own for whether you are doing the assignment option or the paper option. So we're going to start with fake news. The term fake news is in and of itself an oxymoron because news inherently can't be false. News has to be true and reliable information that is given to the public. So if we have something called fake news, a better term for it would just be public misinformation or public disinformation. And that is just exactly what it sounds like. It's information that gets spread under the label as news, but is actually false information meant to mislead or manipulate an audience. So we see that a lot when it comes to things like tabloids. If you're like at the grocery store and you're going through the checkout and there's all those magazines, most of those have some kind of fake news sort of label associated with them because they either make up information or they have false sources that they claim are like anonymous sources when it's a quote that they made up themselves to really just generate sales and grab audience's attention. Almost all of that information that you would read in those magazines, with the exception of People magazine, is usually pretty legit, and Time magazine is reliable. Any other magazine that you see in that kind of situation or online is known for being just completely false. It's rumors that people are spreading. It's based on maybe one image and someone is making up a story to go with it. Maybe one person heard something in passing and now they're writing a story on it. So it's very, very loosely, if at all, based on true information, and it's usually intended to mislead an audience with the intention of getting their attention and making money. So it's a really selfish kind of business venture that unfortunately exists a lot, especially with the rise of the internet, where people are more prone to believe what they read online. We live in an age where people aren't as educated on how to decipher reliable information from disinformation and misinformation, unfortunately. And so people are just more prone to buy into this stuff. And obviously you can make money quicker by just making up a story and posting it online, and it generates a lot of views, than by writing a reliable story and taking the time to edit it and proofread it and getting that out there. That takes more time and isn't as sellable, unfortunately, in some circulations. So that's the problem with fake news, is that it's just false information and it leads consumers to getting really confused. It leads them to be really misinformed about what's going on. Truth versus fiction gets a little difficult to distinguish the lines between. And a lot of the times we see people either reacting where they don't trust any news media or they'll believe anything they see. And obviously those two extremes by the consumer are really problematic, because if they don't believe any news and there's not a reliability on news, then journalists can't get truthful information out there. Their information isn't being circulated. They're not able to inform the public well, and then we still have a misinformed public. And on the flip side, if people are believing anything that they see online, then they're believing false information and we still have a misinformed public. So if the role of the journalist is to inform the public, then you have to really combat fake news by getting honest, truthful information out there. What's hard about that is that fake news is usually free to access, and the people that produce fake news get paid based on like clicks and circulation. So the news itself is free. So that makes it accessible to more people. Whereas a lot of the times right now, more higher stakes, more reliable news outlets have to charge people, or they need to join a subscription, or they have to do some kind of login to access news, just because, like we talked about yesterday, there's a huge decline in circulation of news, and so they have to have a way to generate income. And so if people can't afford, or people don't want to subscribe or do the longer reading that necessarily comes with more in-depth news, then they're going to be more prone to rely on fake news as a way to inform themselves if they're not able to distinguish the difference. And so that's just some issues that come along with fake news and why it's a problem. And right now, the best way to combat that, the best way to combat lies, is with truth. But it's hard when you have a public that doesn't necessarily know how to distinguish the difference between reliable information and unreliable information. And obviously, you guys are taught that in school. You're taught how to determine the difference between like good, real news and what's not. But people of older generations, or people who don't really pay attention to those lessons, don't necessarily have that education on how to distinguish information online. And so that just kind of further snowballs the problem. So that's kind of some of the issues that come along with fake news. In the slide, I have a quote that I thought was really good. News means verifiable information in the public interest, and information that does not meet these standards does not deserve the label of news. In this sense, then, fake news is an oxymoron which lends itself to undermining the credibility of information which does not meet the threshold of verifiability in public interest, i.e. real news. So that just kind of goes off what I was saying. You can't label fake news as news at all. It's better labeled as just misinformation or disinformation. And that's kind of like the tabloid style, quick, easy to access, really short article news that you can find online or really cheap at stores. And yeah, that's why it's a problem for journalists today, just because now not only do they have the pressure of quickly informing the public and getting news out there and trying to generate sales, they also have to combat the myriad of lies and misinformation and disinformation that are being spread by these fake news sources who are really just in it for the money and the circulation. So that's one issue that comes with fake news. If you go on to the next slide, talk just more about the danger of fake news in that it's free, how the spread of disinformation and misinformation is possible through social networks. That's an issue just because social networks like Facebook, Google, Twitter, stuff like that, they're largely hands-off. They don't necessarily go through content as in-depth. They're doing that more now with issues of like privacy invasion, or if something's deemed inappropriate or shouldn't be posted for like anyone to access, stuff like that. So we see content being taken down more, but they're still not at a point where they are ciphering information based on whether or not it's reliable. So it's really easy for fake news to be spread through social media sites because the owners of those platforms aren't doing anything to kind of like check for that. There's not really a process where they go through and read and make sure that information is true and reliable as it gets published on social media. Pretty much anyone can just say whatever they want and get it out there. And that's the issue that comes with social media platforms is like, yes, it's great for communication and staying in touch and spreading information. It's also problematic in terms of anyone can kind of say anything, and, you know, people who are concerned about like privacy and about the overreach of big companies and stuff like that might be more hesitant to allow social media to kind of filter information. So for right now, the way that it currently works, anyone can kind of put anything on social media, so that's where there's even more pressure on educated consumers to spread true and accurate information. That's the best way to combat this, is by, if you are educated and you are able to read information that you know is true and reliable and honest, it's your responsibility as a consumer to share that information so that the truth is actually being circulated rather than just staying in one place when, you know, fake news is being circulated. So that's just some information about fake news and how it affects journalism today. In the UK right now, they're considering making a law where information does have to be filtered to be published online, but in the US, where people tend to value their freedoms, their privacy a lot more, it's going to take a lot more effort to get that information to be filtered. But that's another way to combat this, is if we allow social media platforms to filter the information that is spread out. The next one is sensationalism, and sensationalism is similar to fake news in that it's just based on getting the reader's attention and grabbing the public's interest without necessarily being grounded in facts. So a lot of this is going to be like studies that you see that are based on health, or maybe they saw an image and heard a vague quote about a politician and then they write a whole article around that, even if it's out of context. So with sensationalism, it's more just like, here's a little bit of information that we're connecting and calling true and setting it out there. So it's not as like blatantly false as misinformation and disinformation that we see in fake news, but it is based a lot more on like trying to get audiences' attention, and then the article is kind of grounded in loosely correlated stuff. So the biggest example of that would be like Wakefield's article that he published about the correlation between autism and vaccines, and we know that science today kind of has proven that there is no correlation between that. Vaccines do not cause autism. You cannot say that correlation equals causation. And a lot of the stuff in his study was reliant on the belief that because there was kind of a correlation with these kids who ended up being diagnosed with autism, had these vaccines, he used that correlation and kind of decided it caused it, which we know, and if you're taking stats especially, you should know that correlation does not ever equal causation. There's a lot more factors that have to be considered, and there's been a lot of scientists who've debunked Wakefield's study because of that exact problem. But Wakefield's study was based on sensationalism, which is just like loose information he got from one study and then published it like really broadly through really major medical journals who allowed kind of freelance scientists to publish in that way. And so then people are getting this information from what was a reliable source. This was a reliable health and wellness journal. And so then they're believing that it must be true because it's in this reliable source, when really it's more sensational based, where Wakefield had previously been a pretty reliable doctor, but then this information wasn't legit, but people were believing it. So that's kind of the difference between sensationalism and fake news, is that sensationalism can be more accessible and can come from a reliable source, but it's grounded and based on really loose false information, or hasn't been studied to the extent it needs to be studied, or leaves out a lot of contextual information, stuff like that, and it's just published to grab the reader's attention and kind of seem interesting. So that's sensationalism. And I put a link below that talks specifically about the Wakefield situation and expands a lot on sensationalism. So if you're interested in more information on that, please click on the link in that's slide 30. And then next is clickbait. Clickbait is related to sensationalism and fake news. These all sort of go together, but there's distinguishable factors about each of them. And clickbait is basically just like a really outlandish, wild headline, or like, one-liner from an article that people see that piques their interest and they really want to see it. So if you're on Facebook and you see those links that are like, click here to see like Nancy Pelosi said what, then you're intrigued because you want to know what she said. So you click on this and then it brings you to just like an advertisement or an article that's about nothing, or an article that's about something completely different than what the clickbait headline was about. And basically clickbait is just defined as a form of false advertisement using hyperlink text or a thumbnail link that's designed to attract attention and entice users to follow that link and read, view, or listen to the linked piece of online content, with the defining characteristic of being deceptive, typically sensationalized, or misleading. So clickbait can fall under both sensationalism and fake news, in that they're trying to get your attention using these really outlandish headlines or liners from the article, but then it leads you to ultimately disinformation and misinformation. So clickbait is the primary way that sensationalized news and fake news get spread, is because they have these big exciting headlines that pique your interest, and so then it gets circulated more because people are clicking on it more, and the more clicks something gets with the algorithms that the internet uses, the more it gets circulated. And so then just because of this one headline that's not even based on truth, suddenly this article is all over the place on Facebook, Twitter, Google, whatever site you use, and then people have more access to it, whereas real news doesn't get circulated that way because it's not as like enticing to the public and doesn't receive as many clicks and likes, so the algorithm doesn't spread it around as much, if that makes sense. So that's kind of an issue that is faced with clickbait. Another issue that comes with clickbait, and this is kind of like a roundabout way that we get to this issue, is that right now in news media we see a huge increase of freelance writers, freelance bloggers, people who work for sites like BuzzFeed or Vox or those kind of sites remotely, and they're independent writers, and they get their information in and then it gets circulated more quickly. And because these independent journalists are getting news out quicker and they're writing through independent sources and they don't have to necessarily jump through as many hoops to get their news published, it gets circulated quicker. And then the competition, which would be legitimate news outlets like, say, NPR or CNN or something like that, where they have to go through more of a process to get news published and they don't necessarily work as much with independent writers or vloggers or anything like that, then they lose money because these guys are getting the story out quicker. And so in order to combat that, then we see people from actual reliable news sites starting to rely more on clickbait style headlines so that they can get their information circulating quicker. So BuzzFeed is a lot more popular with like Gen Z and the millennial generation, because it's shorter articles that have really quick information and headlines that grab your attention. So in order to combat that, then we see like CNN and ABC starting to publish articles that have kind of that same attention style headline to grab attention and get the reader's interest. So that is clickbait in the sense that they're trying to combat other outside independent writers by kind of coming up with these more interesting articles that don't necessarily have to do with what the article is about. So the headline is intended to be clickbait just to get more views and likes so that their article is circulated more. So that's just kind of like a pressure that is faced by news outlets today that falls under the category of clickbait, just because in a sort of a desperate attempt to get themselves out of like bankruptcy and to get their news spreading more and to get more attention to their site, they have to come up with more clickbait style articles. And then when they're doing that, sometimes they sacrifice, integrity and journalistic ethics and morals and stuff like that comes into question. So that's how clickbait, sensationalism, and fake news are all correlated, how they impact journalists today, how this issue is a modern issue in journalism. All these things came about kind of as a result of the rise of the internet. And again, like I said, we're in a transitional period where I don't think news is going to die, but I think that journalists and people who work for major news outlets really have to figure out a way to combat these issues that are coming up with the rise of the internet and figure out a way to fight them in a more reliable way that still gets accurate, reliable news out there without having to rely on tactics like clickbait and sensationalism to get their articles in circulation. Because again, like I talked about, all that does is either lead to a mistrust of all news and media in the eye of the public, or it leads to the public believing any information that they see on the internet. So that's just sort of some of those issues that have to do specifically with clickbait, fake news, and sensationalism. I added a couple of links that explain those issues a lot more in depth and in a lot more detail. If you're interested in explaining those more closely, I'm not speaking correctly, in examining those more closely, because they explain it a lot better and in a lot more depth. Otherwise, that's about all that I have for today. So please review these slides just so you still get that information. And then again, if you are choosing one of those 3 topics to specifically examine for your assignment or your paper, I added some links that you can use to aid in your research. As always, you can email me with any questions or comment with any questions on any of the material presented. But that's it for this week. I'll post another assignment on Monday. Make sure you get your articles done and turned in as soon as possible so we can edit those and get them published.